On the north coast of Devon, there lies a dear little village named Clovelly. With its narrow cobbled streets and pristine whitewashed cottages, it's the archetype of a quaint seaside village. However, if you follow those charming cobbled streets all the way down to the sea and walk along the beach that lines Clovelly Bay, you'll soon come across a waterfall cascading down the cliff face, and not far from there you'll find a deep dark cave that goes on for miles, and a place named the Devil's Kitchen. Now, to look at it, you might not think that anyone could live in such a dark and inhospitable place, but back in the 1700s it was indeed home to a man named John Gregg. John had been born in a small village 8 or 9 miles east of Exeter, to a labouring couple who made their living through hedging and ditching. They were an honest pair, upstanding and God-fearing, and they tried as best they could to pass along their values and their trade to the boy. John, however, found more reward in idleness and brutality than he did in honest hard work, so, as soon as he was able, he absconded with a local woman who shared his proclivities. After much travelling, they eventually chose to settle down in the aforementioned cave. There they stayed for more than 25 years, and in all this time had little to do with any other soul other than those belonging to the 14 children and 32 grandchildren they begat in the vilest fashion. Depraved though they were, we may never have heard of the Gregg family, had they simply stayed in their cave and not bothered anybody but each other. Unfortunately, John and his brood had no taste for decency and couldn't abide the taste of what sustenance the sea could provide. So, to support themselves, they became experts in the art of ambushing unsuspecting travellers. They would set their traps and lie in wait along the long, isolated roads that crisscrossed their domain, until some poor, unsuspecting innocent would cross their path. Then, in a flash, they'd be up and on 'em. With knives and teeth and haggard nails, they'd pounce, slashing throats and tearing flesh, wrenching their very life away as they begged for a mercy that would never come. Once their prey had been subdued, they'd gather up any clothes or coin or goods they could find and ferry it all back to that deep, dark cave. They'd always make sure to take something else as well. You see, for all their many sins, the Gregg family had one virtue. They never let fresh meat go to waste. Right there in that hellish cavern, they would take their victim's carcass, divide it into quarters and place the jointed flesh in huge great barrels of brine, to be pickled and later consumed once the fancy took 'em. Of course, the residents of the surrounding towns were not blind or deaf to the disappearance of their neighbours. Each time another went missing, they'd send out search parties, but nothing was ever found. In fact, more often than not, the search parties themselves would fail to return from their venture. On the occasions they did return, they'd swear blind they'd searched high and low, that they'd combed the woods, inspected the beach, and surveilled every inch of the coastline. Nothing was ever found, though, for John Gregg's clan knew to leave no survivors and made sure to leave no trace. Even when the tide was out and a party of searchers passed by the mouth of that cave, they never thought to step inside. After all, what could possibly live in a place as infernal as that? Over the years, a number of innocents were accused of being party to the disappearances. Travellers from outside the county or locals who had been maliciously tarred by their neighbours. One year, the finger of blame was pointed squarely at a number of innkeepers after it was found out that they had housed some of the missing. Some were tried and found innocent, some were hung by the court, others were beaten to death by angry crowds afeared for their own lives. Nothing stopped the disappearances, though, and nothing brought the missing back. Then, one day, a man and his wife chose to visit a local fair. Enamoured as they were with each other, they shared the back of one horse so that each could indulge in the closeness of the other. Upon reaching the fair, they danced and they caroused and they ate and they drank, and then, flushed with happiness, they chose to return home via the shorter route through Clovelly woods. Like all of those who lived locally, they'd heard the stories of those who'd gone missing, but thought they'd be safe so long as they didn't travel after dark. I'd like to think that the pair got to share one last moment of joy before the horror that befell them once the Gregg clan struck, but I can't be sure. What is certain is that the couple fought back like demons, riding down at least 2 of their attackers and greeting the rest with boot leather and fists. In the end, though, they were hopelessly outnumbered, and before long the wife found herself being pulled down from the horse. Upon seeing this sight, her husband froze, immobile. Seized by a catatonic horror, he was forced to watch helplessly as the pack of feral cannibals descended on his beloved, forced by some unseen gibbet to stand idle as they slit her throat, as they drank her blood straight from the wound like a fine wine, as they tore her entrails from her body and slurped at them like fat sausages from the grill. Dormant as he was, he'd surely have been next if his horse hadn't bolted and carried him far down the road back towards the fair. Once returned, he regaled the townsfolk with his tale of murder and pleaded for their assistance. So, once armed with mattocks and bills, they returned to the site of the attack. There they investigated the bloody remnants of the feast, prepared what little was left of the wife for burial, and raised the hue and cry. For 25 years, John Gregg and his clan had left no witnesses alive and nary a speck to evidence their attacks, but in one day they had left both, and that would be their undoing. Upon hearing of the atrocity, the Mayor of Exeter sent word to the king, who immediately dispatched 400 men tasked with tracking down the perpetrators. For weeks on end they scoured the countryside, searching every building, every cranny and every crack, but found nothing of consequence. That was, of course, until one of the king's men walked past the threshold of their cavern, accompanied by a pack of bloodhounds. At first, just 1 or 2 caught a whiff of the Gregg scent and pricked up their ears as if contemplating its provenance. Then the scent took hold of the pack and drove them into a furious cacophony of barking. In short order the hounds darted into the inky black depths of the cave, with the king's men not long behind them. Once inside, they followed the winding serpentine tunnels until they came across a wide open chamber and found themselves confronted by the family storehouse. There, in front of them, a multitude of limbs and torsos hung suspended from iron hooks. Disembodied organs bobbed about in barrels of brine, and human skin lay stretched across wicker frames to dry. Behind them, piles of clothes, coins, pistols and swords climbed the walls, and an army of rats feasted on the detritus that covered the floors. 25 years of trophies and victuals stretched out before them, arranged in a fiendish plateau. Some of the men bolted from the chamber. Others fell to their knees in prayer, or else heaved torrents of vomit onto the floor. The sturdiest among them simply stared in stunned disbelief at the scene. Once the shock subsided, though, the rage took over, and for the next 2 hours they purged that cave of every single resident. Vicious though the Greggs certainly were whenever they outnumbered lightly armed travellers, they were easily subdued when matched against trained men armed with muskets and good steel. Once every single family member had been secured and shackled along the beach, the king's men packed up those goods that still had value and sent all the flesh they could find to the nearest churchyard for a decent burial. From there the prisoners were marched to Exeter jail, and from there on to Plymouth, where, without process, mercy or succour, they were immediately put to death. The men of the family were dispatched first. Stripped naked, they were placed in front of 3 large fires and tightly restrained before being publicly dissected in front of the baying crowd. First, their members were removed and tossed into the fires before them. Next, their noses, ears and tongues were sliced off and similarly incinerated. Once this had been accomplished, their hands were removed, followed by their feet, then their arms and finally their legs. When all that was left of them was a bleeding torso, their eyes were removed and then placed in their mouths before they were finally allowed to die. The rest of the family were then trussed up by their wrists and ankles and thrown upon the fires to burn with what remained of their menfolk. According to the witnesses, not one member of the family displayed an ounce of either remorse or fear or horror. Instead, they stared with hungry eyes, enraptured by the execution of their fellows, all the while repeating a strange invocation to some fell deity. It's not known what led John Gregg and his family to embrace a life so full of horror. Maybe he was evil from his first breath, or maybe it was something in that cave. Something that opened the gates for wickedness to walk in. Who can know? It is said, though, that if you walk past the mouth of that cave when the wind is blowing in just the right direction, you can smell just a hint of sulphur in the air and hear the slight chattering of hungry voices coming from its depths.